So just looking at Hong Kong as a model for Ukraine's occupied territory. How Margaret Thatcher struck an innovative agreement, as it was referred to at the time, with Deng Xiaoping in 1984 that avoided hot war and laid the ground for a peaceful, though imperfect, transfer of power. And could something like this agreement be replicated today for Ukraine? The day that I'm recording this is November the 28th, 2025. And in the past 24 hours, Yermak, being very close to Zelensky, has said, as long as Zelensky is president, no one should count on us giving up territory. He will not sign away territory. And not a single sane person today would sign a document to give up territory. While at the same time, President Putin has said,
when Ukrainian troops will leave their positions, that will be the stop for the war. If they're not going to leave their positions, we will fight them.
How to reconcile these two positions. So I've just been reading this book, Treaty for a Lost City, the Sino-British Joint Declaration. It's a book about the negotiations for the handover of Hong Kong from Britain to China. And the book is brilliant in the degree to which it intertwines diplomatic and legal analysis. Some viewers immediately will be shouting at their laptops, well, with China imposing its extradition law on Hong Kong in 2019 and the further national security legislation in 2020, that agreement didn't go very well. I'd like to take the other side and argue that from the actual balance of power that was in place in 1984, the agreement negotiated on behalf of Prime Minister Thatcher was actually a great outcome. Thatcher recounted that Deng had told her directly, I could walk in and take the whole lot this afternoon. To which she replied, there is nothing I could do to stop you, but the eyes of the world would now know what China is like. That's not a terribly strong position of deterrence. The options on the table for Thatcher were essentially, and this is quite far on, this is quite deep into the negotiations, but just going straight to the endgame. The options were Britain capitulating to China in 1984 and essentially just giving the territory to China once the lease on it had expired. Option B, the UK going to war against China for indefensible territory. This was 2 years after the Falklands War, where the UK and Thatcher specifically had shown her mettle in willingness to go to war where the UK could actually win. So this is the UK going to war against Argentina and actually sending naval vessels halfway around the world, killing more than 600 Argentinians to show, no, this is our land. Or option C, not accepting either of those and trying to come up with a creative approach that ultimately resulted in the transferring of the territory to essentially making it an autonomous region and then transferring it over a number of decades to China. To quote J.K. Galbraith, one of President JFK's ambassadors, and this is in a letter to JFK himself in 1962, politics is not the art of the possible. It consists in choosing between the disastrous and the unpalatable. I assert there were no better alternatives for Thatcher. Just a very high-level overview of the agreement. The island of Hong Kong had been part of the British Empire since 1842. Part of the island was operating on a 99-year lease, which was to expire in 1997. Around 1982, the future destiny of Hong Kong seemed uncertain and fraught. Land agreements couldn't properly be negotiated, and there were fears that Hong Kong's economy would collapse if a new agreement wasn't struck. After a multi-year process of negotiations between Britain and China, it was ultimately agreed that China would resume sovereignty over Hong Kong as of July 1997, but Hong Kong was to become a special administrative region, and it would retain a high degree of autonomy, except in foreign affairs and defence, but existing rights and freedoms would endure for 50 years. So this commencing in 1997, supposedly running all the way through to 2047. The treaty was signed in December 1984, and yes, China did, in a sense, take Hong Kong by force in 2019, 2020. Depending on how you count it, you could say the agreement that Thatcher negotiated bought Hong Kong You could say 22 years of autonomy if you count from 1997. I personally think it's actually fairer to count from 1984 and say that it bought Hong Kong 35 years of further British administration and then going on autonomy, because the alternative was Deng going in and invading. Some of the thinking that went into this deal. Firstly, Western negotiators hoped that by 2047, this is a very optimistic take on the agreement, China would have evolved, perhaps liberalized politically and economically. So this is the kind of Fukuyama-like end of history thinking pervading through, rendering the provision moot. So the 50-year transition period was designed to ensure continuity and confidence during a sensitive transfer of sovereignty, not to enshrine permanent autonomy. Secondly, Thatcher convinced herself that a clear legal treaty guaranteeing Hong Kong's autonomy under the one country, two systems formula was preferable to unilateral annexation. And one could say the same of the occupied territory in Ukraine today. Some kind of autonomous handover might be preferable to unilateral annexation. Thirdly, Thatcher sought to extract a moral and symbolic victory from the compromise, insisting on a formal and ceremonious signing to underscore Britain's dignity and to avoid the appearance of coerced surrender. Again, this feels potentially apt for Ukraine. However, she never trusted Beijing's assurances, and after 1997, she repeatedly complained that China would not honour the deal, echoing the scepticism that she had voiced privately at the time. And fourthly, legal and administrative guarantees were struck. Structures for governance, rights and economic policy were written into the handover framework, meant to be internationally monitored. The agreement was registered at the United Nations, giving it formal international standing. Analogizing today with Ukraine, the populations of the two areas were somewhat comparable. Hong Kong's population in 1984 was 5.4 million. Russia's occupied territory in Ukraine today, the territory taken since 2022 and thus excluding Crimea, is estimated around 3.5 million. The big difference is this agreement was to settle an expiring lease on territory, and it was a means to avoid hot war. It wasn't a way to settle an already raging war. But I believe there are still negotiating lessons to be derived from this history that can be drawn to craft a territorial exchange. In this crude analogy, the UK in 1984 is somewhat analogous to the US mediating the agreement today in Ukraine. China in 1984 is somewhat analogous to Russia. I think the most apt analogy is actually Deng with Putin. A lot of their language is very similar. And lastly, Hong Kong is somewhat analogous to Russian occupied territory in Ukraine, in addition to the remainder of the Donbas. The following quotations are an intermingling of Treaty for a Lost City, which was written by a Hong Kong-based lawyer, and Charles Moore's second volume of Margaret Thatcher. So we actually get both sides of the perspective in a really good way looking at the two books. Charles Moore. Abrogation alone would be unthinkable. It would produce immediate panic in Hong Kong. What Thatcher wanted was an agreement with China which would define the new arrangements. If she was satisfied that they were acceptable to the people of Hong Kong, there would then be a new situation in which I consider the question of sovereignty. So just crucially looking at the sequencing there, Thatcher is saying, let's get an agreement on what's going to happen with the territory, and then we can talk about sovereignty. But as we go on, Deng is insisting that the sequencing is the other way around. When Thatcher tried to negotiate continued British administration, Deng flatly refused. China's position was clear: sovereignty over the entire territory. If talks failed, China could simply take Hong Kong by force. So again, this is very analogous with Putin today in the Donbas. Britain had no military leverage. Britain did not hold the cards. The territory was indefensible. The capitalist system in Hong Kong would remain, but the return of sovereignty to China could not be delayed. If it came to a choice, sovereignty would take precedence over prosperity. I think this is exactly Putin's mindset today, as best as I can discern. Sovereignty will take precedence over prosperity. No amount of sanctions or otherwise are going to get Putin to bend on that. From the author of Treaty for a Lost City, if you look at not just the treaty, but the background to the treaty, the negotiations nearly broke down because initially the United Kingdom would not concede on the issue of sovereignty. It was Percy Craddock, the British chief negotiator, who was previously the British ambassador to Beijing, and I should just say, to the degree I've looked at this, Percy Craddock seems to have immense diplomatic empathy. He deeply understood China in a way that a lot of the other political figures around Thatcher back in Westminster did not. Craddock drafted a letter for Thatcher to break the deadlock. The formula was that Britain will concede on sovereignty if the outcome of the negotiations were acceptable to the people of Hong Kong. So it's there, just like slightly beginning to shift the sequencing from the British perspective. Charles Moore writes, and again this is kind of the British account in biography, the process described was a year's work in getting Mrs. Thatcher to see reason. The China hands knew all along that sovereignty would have to be ceded. They simply had to convince Mrs. Thatcher of the inevitable. So perhaps here Thatcher is somewhat analogous to Zelensky. As time passed, Mrs. Thatcher, who always had a genuine regard and affection for Percy Craddock, did end up tacitly accepting many of his arguments. The path towards eventual agreement with China was one strewn with concessions which she did not want and had to make despite herself. So Britain really did make a series of concessions to make this agreement possible. A diplomatic telegram to Washington. The Chinese are adamant that both sovereignty and administration will be recovered, and have characterized our insistence on British administration as an insuperable obstacle to progress. They have hinted strongly that they will break off talks if there is no change in the British position. And again, I think it's possible that Putin is making such threats as that on the territory of the Donbas today. The Chinese will be ready, if necessary, to sacrifice the economic benefits they obtain from Hong Kong in order to achieve their political objectives. It would be dangerously wrong to assume that they will back down in a confrontation once they saw the damage being done to the Hong Kong economy. There had previously been three options. Option A, continued British administration, and this was just totally shut down by China. Option B, accepting the Chinese plan. Thatcher wouldn't have been able to go along with this politically at home. Thus, option C was accepting the Chinese plan, but to explore what flexibility there might be in the Chinese concept of administration and what guarantees in the form of continued British links the Chinese would be prepared to build into their plan. So it's taking the baseline of China's offering and making that slightly better, rather than Britain trying to insert its own plan and then adapting that to China. Craddock's view was that breakdown was not inevitable and that the UK should explore the last, option C, that is to say, China having sovereignty, no British administration, but to seek to preserve British links. Craddock added, I realise that this is a serious step, this is a big concession, and that the local executive council in Hong Kong will find it difficult to contemplate. The governor, meaning Governor of Hong Kong, will no doubt give his views on how they should be consulted. So he's basically saying the people on the ground in Hong Kong are going to be very, very unhappy with this, much as if the US is having to make concessions about the territory of Ukraine, the people on the ground in Ukraine, particularly in the occupied territory, they're going to be unhappy. While it might be thought that such a step should be considered only after a breakdown of talks, it would, in Craddock's view, create an unacceptable risk, described as extremely dangerous, since the UK would then have nowhere to fall back upon, a retreat would have to be conducted in public view, and further havoc would be brought upon the Hong Kong economy. So this is interesting. A lot of people around Margaret Thatcher are saying, don't yet give in from option A and hold on for British administration. And Craddock is almost the sole voice close to her saying, no, we must make this concession now, because if we don't, China is going to walk away from the negotiating table. They're just going to do something militarily, and we absolutely do not want that. Acting, and this part is very, very interesting, acting on the advice of the local members in Hong Kong. Option B, the allowing of the possibility of Chinese administration after 1997, was to have been no more than a tactic to draw the Chinese negotiators in, while at the same time pursuing option C. So interestingly, the British basically hinted that they were open to the Chinese plan as a means of getting the very reluctant Chinese side back to the negotiating table, even though they had the intention of actually exploring what further flexibility there would be. In other words, conceding on sovereignty conditionally was a fig leaf, only a negotiating ploy. So that's how they get the Chinese side to actually go along with the talks. any risk of China declaring that the UK had in fact conceded the issue of continued British administration could and would have been denied vigorously in public, and ministers in London had all agreed to this. Craddock reporting on the 7th day of the 6th round of negotiations, and incidentally I believe Ambassador Witkoff is about to make his 6th trip to Moscow, stated that while the UK wanted to get into the minutiae of autonomy, China refused to get into these treacherous details and was immovable on first addressing the broad question of sovereignty and the non-negotiability of any continued British administration. During that 6th round, a clear assurance was required in the view of Britain's ambassador to Beijing in order to allay Chinese fears. I can very much imagine Putin having that same robust ask today, that in order for talks to keep going, Russia must get that assurance on the territory. Immediately after the 6th round, which Craddock considered had gone very badly, notwithstanding the fact that the UK had kept China in the talks, Craddock proposed the following formula. I wish to make it clear that the British side understands that the Chinese plan is based upon the premise that both sovereignty and the right of administration over the whole of Hong Kong should revert to China. The British side does not intend to make any proposal on links between Britain and Hong Kong which conflicts with the premise that both sovereignty and the right of administration over the whole of Hong Kong should revert to China in 1997. So that is a very emphatic concession that Craddock here is finally making. In particular, the British side does not intend to propose any link of accountability or authority between the government of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region after 1997 and the British government at any level. The British side would also be working on the assumption that any British subjects who continue to serve in Hong Kong as government officials would be in the employment of the government of the Special Administrative Region and would owe their loyalties to that government. They would not be appointed by the British government, nor would they be responsible to London. So Britain is essentially saying here, the territory is yours, China. We just need this special administrative region to make it politically tenable for us to be able to go along with the agreement. Naturally, such British assurances during the 5th and 6th rounds of negotiation in October and November remained conditional, but that is to state only the obvious, since nothing is done until everything is done in any treaty negotiation. All of these details would now pave the way for detailed discussions on the post-handover arrangements for Hong Kong, where previously the negotiations had been sterile and desultory. Indeed, the 7th round, held on the 7th and 8th of December, was by all accounts more positive. Craddock was then to comment in a further telegram, "This was perhaps the most positive session so far. It would seem that the formula presented to the Chinese side in November, taken together with the Prime Minister's message and subsequent explanations, have finally brought the Chinese to the point where they are ready to discuss practical matters." So in making this concession, China is actually being willing to get into the weeds of other issues. British Cabinet Office minutes at the time. It was now clear that the Chinese government were not prepared to accept what had been the original British objective of a continuing British presence in Hong Kong, nor would they accept any link of authority. The aim must now be to negotiate on the basis of the Chinese proposals, so again it's that flipping of sequencing, in order to make them more acceptable and workable, even if at the end of the process the proposals might well not be such as the government could positively commend to Parliament or to the people of Hong Kong. And the British biographical account here, in 2 days, questions that had stalled for years were suddenly settled. As a mark of the importance of the moment, and perhaps of his victory, Deng Xiaoping himself arrived after a 5-hour train journey from his seaside holiday resort. Agreement was reached now that the Chinese believed they had gotten the recognition of the sovereignty they had always claimed. They could be more flexible. So making that concession, China can then talk about other matters. Considering the people in the territory, the accounts given thus far may be thought to be incomplete in one glaring aspect. What of Hong Kong and views from Hong Kong? That was an entirely British concern in these bipartite negotiations, a concern which, from all accounts, elicited only great suspicion on the Chinese side. A delegation from Hong Kong had made its way to London in January with a list of inconvenient questions. These included how acceptability to Hong Kong will be measured, the status of British dependent territories' citizenship in the future, the ways to ensure China's future compliance with treaty terms, and also a call for greater assurances that implementing legislation would in fact conform to the treaty. China's position had been consistent, that the negotiations should not extend into matters concerning the detailed policies that would apply to Hong Kong after the handover, for otherwise, from China's viewpoint, China would be negotiating the precise and detailed terms of a transfer from Britain, which would be anathema to it. In the Chinese view, China would resume sovereignty and declare on its own terms its own policies towards Hong Kong. So there is a little bit of doublethink there as well. China's saying you don't have any hand in what's going on at all, and Britain is trying to still impose terms as to exactly how the territory would be managed for the 50 years afterwards. For the Chinese government, who regarded Hong Kong as theirs, the idea of Hong Kong people having a say over their future was a heresy, even a reward for being unpatriotic. Deng, in particular, felt this strongly. Again, I think that is very potentially very fitting with how Putin feels. As to Thatcher, to transfer land was one thing, to transfer people was another. That she, the great cold warrior, might end up delivering a free people to communism was an unbearable thought. But the reality is that the talks were conducted without meaningful input from the people of Hong Kong. That's what both accounts of history emphasise. Mrs. Thatcher signed the Hong Kong Agreement in what she described as a spirit of pride and of optimism. The next day, she flew to sell it to the anxious but mostly welcoming people of the colony she had just agreed to hand over. Huge difficulties remained. The full detail flowing from the agreement had to be worked out and the basic law secured. The question of nationality and British passports for Hong Kong people was extremely sensitive and would become more so whenever something went wrong in China. Wherever territorial lines are drawn today between Ukraine and Russia, that's of course going to be an issue, where the passports stand and so forth. No one could really know how China, emerging under Deng from utter totalitarianism, would behave. Mrs. Thatcher had not got what she had set out to attain in 1982, or anything like it. So Britain really did have to make a great deal of concessions in this agreement. How the agreement was received internationally. In Thatcher's own words, at the signing ceremony, the agreement had been widely praised by other governments and international organisations. The Secretary-General of the United Nations had described it as an example for other countries the way in which difficult international problems can be successfully resolved. The concept of one country, two systems, preserving two different political, social and economic systems within one nation, has no precedent. It offers an administrative and imaginative response to the special historical circumstances of Hong Kong. The concept is an example of how apparently intractable problems can and should be resolved. The Secretary-General of the United Nations, in his own words, one of the most outstanding examples of effective, quiet diplomacy in contemporary international relations. Quite some praise. And Charles Powell, who was Thatcher's Foreign Affairs advisor, and notably is the brother of Jonathan Powell, the current British National Security Advisor, also recognised, however, that it was a remarkable agreement given that the Chinese could have just walked into Hong Kong. It was generally acknowledged at the time that no better solution could have been achieved. Charles Moore, again, his book was published in 2015. Flushed by her victory in the Falklands, Thatcher had dared to dream that Hong Kong could remain proudly British. In this, she failed, and was bound to fail. But she also dared to dream that the free capitalist society which Britain had brought into existence could be preserved from communism by agreement with communists. In this, though it may still be too early to finally judge, she partially succeeded. And again, my looking at this history with fresh eyes, I think we need to count from 1984 through to 2019, 2020. So Hong Kong got 35 years of further British rule and then autonomy. I think that is a success. This is a quotation from one of the books that I loved. Thatcher's treatment of Deng as an equal when they met was completely baffling for the Chinese. It made them say, hang on, they've just squashed the Argies, meaning Argentina, in the 1982 Falklands War, where again, Britain did have to kill 600 Argentinian soldiers to show them how serious they were. They've got Polaris, it's referring to nuclear submarines, perhaps they won't give Hong Kong back. In this view, if Mrs. Thatcher had behaved according to diplomatic norms, the Chinese would have won hands down. By being bolder, she achieved seismic uncertainty. So Thatcher is clearly an early adopter of peace through strength. The agreement did go bad from a British perspective today. China drove through its extradition law in 2019 and the further national security legislation in 2020, such that, again, Hong Kong got 22 of an agreed 50 years of autonomy, or 35 if you count from 1984. Many Brits, the majority of Brits, would argue that China has not upheld its end of the bargain. And I've actually read through the treaty. I read through it yesterday. There is a reasonable case for this. This is a quotation from the treaty itself. After the establishment of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region, the socialist system and socialist policies shall not be practiced in the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region, and Hong Kong's previous capitalist system and the lifestyle shall remain unchanged for 50 years. The Special Administrative Region shall enjoy a high degree of autonomy. The Hong Kong Special Administrative Region government shall protect the rights and freedoms of inhabitants, shall maintain the rights and freedoms as provided for by the laws previously enforced in Hong Kong, including freedom of the person, of speech, of the press, of assembly, of association. And you can just say that that has not happened. But from another perspective, few in Thatcher's inner circle ever truly believed that one country, two systems would endure unchanged. The UK, during the actual handover period between 1984 and 1997, introduced democratic reforms 3 years before the actual handover. This was needlessly provocative, and Percy Craddock, again Thatcher's chief negotiator on the agreement, was robustly opposed to the UK doing this. And China today will argue that the initial treaty that gave Britain right to Hong Kong in the first place, way back in 1842, that was based on a very long and ugly history of the Opium Wars. I won't get into that, but just that there is another perspective that China has looking at the agreement today. In a conservative assessment, we would say that Hong Kong got 22 of the agreed 50 years of autonomy. But again, I would just stress, what was the alternative? I strongly assert that the agreement is something of a positive example of a peaceful transfer of significant territory, and it suggests that the idea of making territory an autonomous region as an interstitial step between passing it from one country to another is an interesting idea. In closing, and just tying this all back to Ukraine, there was a 15-year pause on territory agreed between Ukraine and Russia in the March and April 2022 talks in Istanbul. The following is one of Zelensky's closest advisors, Mikhailo Podolyak, and this clip is from March 29th, 2022.
As for Crimea and Sevastopol, we have agreed bilaterally with the Russian Federation to a 15-year pause and to conduct bilateral talks regarding the status of these territories. Today's documents on the agreement about security guarantees are sufficient for announcing and holding the meeting between presidents.
And former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, who was mediating directly between Putin and Zelensky himself during this period in 2022, had also suggested the idea of a freeze.
The territorial issue is, I saw solutions in that regard too. I'd rather not go into that. They are primarily related to postponing the argument by 99 years. All kinds of solutions in the middle.
So perhaps in some sense it could be worth US negotiators today giving Naftali a call and just getting his sense of exactly what he meant by that.
Like David Avidan said, everything takes time. Time takes everything, yes. I knew from our rounds versus Gaza versus Hezbollah, it's very hard to reach a ceasefire. Why is that? As usual, because the internal politics of each side, neither side can seem to be giving up, to be losing, to be weak.
The handover of territory is the thorniest issue of all to bring the Ukraine-Russia war to a resolution. The lesson from the negotiations regarding Hong Kong is that time can be used as a deal-making ingredient to allow for creativity with terms, forming an imperfect solution, but one that might just be face-saving enough for both sides to get behind.